Have you ever looked out over a field so lush and vibrant that it practically steals the air from your lungs? That was Frank's field. To anyone passing by, it might have seemed like just another stretch of farmland, but to Frank it was far more than that. It was the heart of his family's story, a piece of land that carried generations of sweat, patience, and pride. His grandfather had once stood in that same soil, planting the first crops with hope in his eyes. His father had expanded the fields and taught Frank how to read the land like a book. And now Frank cared for it himself, rising before dawn each day to tend the crops and protect the land that had given his family everything. That field wasn't just productive farmland. It was a symbol of perseverance, tradition, and the quiet beauty of working in harmony with nature. But the peaceful paradise Frank had spent his life protecting was about to face an unexpected threat, not from drought, pests, or storms, but from something far more frustrating: arrogance. The trouble began when a brand new upscale housing development started appearing on the property next door. At first, Frank paid little attention. Construction crews came and went. Large houses rose from the ground, and paved roads replaced what used to be open countryside. The developers proudly called it progress. But along with the expensive homes came something else: a strict homeowners association, complete with polished brochures, manicured lawns, and pages upon pages of rules. Frank had no interest in their neighborhood politics. He stayed on his side of the fence, tending his crops while the new residents settled into their pristine homes. But what he didn't realize was that this development would soon create the biggest problem he had ever faced. One morning, Frank woke up to the loud roar of heavy machinery. Bulldozers and excavators were working right along the edge of his property line. At first, he assumed they were finishing construction for the neighborhood roads. But as he watched more closely, he noticed something strange. The workers weren't digging inside the development. They were digging right next to his field. Within hours, a massive drainage pipe was installed. It was thick, industrial, and pointed directly toward Frank's land. At the time, he didn't fully understand what it meant. Then the rain came. The first major storm after the pipe was installed changed everything. What used to be a gentle rainfall that soaked into the soil and nourished his crops suddenly became something far more destructive. Water rushed through the new development's paved streets and perfectly trimmed lawns, gathering speed as it flowed into the storm drains. And then it exploded out of that pipe. A violent torrent of water blasted onto Frank's property. It wasn't just rainwater either. It was thick with mud, debris, and sediment washed from the construction site. Within hours, the peaceful green field Frank had nurtured for years turned into a muddy swamp. Young crops were buried underwater. Fertile soil washed away in thick brown waves. Entire sections of the field disappeared beneath standing water. Frank stood there in disbelief, staring across the devastation. This wasn't a natural flood. It was an invasion. He knew immediately that he had to confront the people responsible. So he walked straight into the housing development and headed for the HOA office. After asking around, he eventually found the president of the association, a woman named Karen. She was standing in front of her immaculate house, carefully inspecting a row of perfectly trimmed rose bushes. Frank approached politely and explained the situation. He showed her photos of his flooded field and pointed out the enormous drainage pipe that had been installed near the property line. Calmly, he explained that the pipe was redirecting all the stormwater from their neighborhood straight onto his farmland, destroying the crops he relied on to make a living. Karen listened, but her reaction was far from sympathetic. Instead of concern, her face showed nothing but mild boredom. When Frank finished speaking, she simply shrugged her shoulders and gave a small, smug smile. "Well," she said casually, "the water has to go somewhere, doesn't it? It's not our problem where it ends up." Frank was stunned by her response. He tried again, explaining the legal issues involved in redirecting natural water flow onto someone else's property. He talked about the damage being caused and how it could easily be fixed by redirecting the drainage elsewhere. Karen crossed her arms and sighed impatiently. "Our plans were approved," she said flatly. "If you don't like it, you can take it up with your lawyer. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a garden club meeting to get to." And with that, she walked away. That moment changed everything. What had started as a frustrating problem quickly became something much deeper. It was no longer just about water. It was about arrogance. It was about someone dismissing a lifetime of hard work like it meant nothing. Frank might have been a quiet farmer, but he wasn't foolish. He had spent his entire life studying the land, watching how water moved through soil, learning how nature behaved during storms and floods. And if the HOA wanted to play hardball, Frank realized he didn't need a courtroom battle to win. He just needed a better plan. Suing them would take years, and lawyers were expensive. Instead, Frank decided to handle the situation in a way he understood best, by working with the land itself. Over the next several weeks, Frank began making phone calls and scheduling meetings. He spoke with agricultural engineers, drainage experts, and even a clever property lawyer who specialized in water disputes. Together, they studied the layout of his land and the flow of the runoff coming from the development. Frank learned everything he could about water rights, drainage systems, and fluid dynamics. Slowly, a plan began forming in his mind. It was elegant, it was perfectly legal, and most importantly, it could be built entirely on his own land. Soon, construction began on Frank's side of property line. Excavators and earth-moving equipment started digging long channels across sections of his field. From the perspective of the HOA residents, it probably looked ridiculous. Just a farmer digging random trenches in the dirt. Some of them likely laughed, assuming Frank was desperately trying to build a crude drainage system. But what Frank was really building was something far more sophisticated. He carefully carved deep channels and reinforced them with stone and soil barriers. He calculated the slopes and gradients with incredible precision, making sure every inch of the system guided water exactly where he wanted it to go. Large culverts were installed to carry massive volumes of water, while smaller check dams helped control the flow. Piece by piece, an intricate network of channels spread across his land. But the system wasn't designed simply to protect his crops. It had a second purpose. The entire design relied on gravity, a silent, powerful force that required no electricity and no machinery. It would simply wait patiently for the right conditions. The final piece of Frank's plan was the most important of all, a massive earthen berm. From a distance, it looked like a natural rise in the landscape, blending perfectly into the terrain. But in reality, it had been carefully engineered and placed at the lowest point of his property, exactly where the HOA's drainage pipe discharged its water. Weeks turned into months. Eventually, the system was finished. Frank's field looked quiet again, as if nothing had changed. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood next door continued as usual. Residents enjoyed their community pool, their spotless lawns, and their comfortable sense of superiority. Most of them had already forgotten about the farmer and his flooded field. But nature doesn't forget, and neither did Frank. Then one night, the storm arrived. It wasn't an ordinary rainstorm. Dark clouds rolled across the sky, turning the afternoon light into a dim gray haze. Soon the rain began falling in heavy sheets. Weather alerts buzzed across phones and televisions, warning of flash floods throughout the region. Inside the HOA neighborhood, the sophisticated drainage system did exactly what it was designed to do. Water rushed off rooftops and driveways, flowed into storm drains, and gathered into a powerful current beneath the streets. Moments later, that water shot out of the same large pipe aimed directly at Frank's field. A raging river runoff surged onto his property. But this time, the water didn't spread across his crops. Instead, it was immediately captured by Frank's network of channels. The system sprang to life. Water rushed through the carefully carved pathways, guided smoothly through culverts and bends. The flow gained speed and power as it followed the precise route Frank had designed months earlier. Finally, the massive torrent reached the far end of the system. There it slammed directly into the enormous earthen berm. With nowhere else to go, the water began to rise. Minute by minute the pressure built, creating a growing reservoir behind the barrier. Then, just as Frank had planned, the water reached a critical level and began flowing backward. A powerful reverse current surged uphill, back toward the source. Inside the HOA neighborhood, families sat comfortably indoors, watching the storm through their windows. Then the first strange signs appeared. A faint gurgling sound echoed from the basement drains. A small puddle formed on the floor. Within minutes, those puddles became streams. The neighborhood's storm drains, completely overwhelmed by the sudden backflow of water, began forcing the flood directly into the homes themselves. Basement drains erupted as water surged upward, pouring into finished living spaces. Panic spread instantly. Expensive home theaters, private gyms, and carefully designed wine cellars were suddenly filling with murky brown water. Residents scrambled to move furniture and valuables, but the flood rose too quickly. Phones rang nonstop at the fire department and HOA office. Karen's phone buzzed relentlessly as terrified homeowners reported basements turning into indoor swimming pools. Meanwhile, Frank stood quietly on his porch beneath the shelter of the awning, watching the storm roll across the horizon. His crops were safe. The system had worked perfectly. Every drop of water was being guided away from his field and redirected exactly where it had originally come from. In the distance, emergency lights flashed while frantic residents rushed through the rain. Frank lifted his coffee mug and took a slow sip. A small, satisfied smile appeared on his face. After all, as Karen had so confidently said, the water had to go somewhere, and tonight it had finally gone home.